My name is Jon Oberheide. I'll be talking about probably some stuff that is different than the previous presentation. If you don't use Linux or haven't heard of GrrCON or PAX or haven't written exploit in your life, then this might not be the most interesting talk to you. It's going to be deeply technical. But if you're willing to stick around and you'd rather see this than the European point of view on data security and privacy, I encourage you to hang out here. I don't know, I think that's what's going on in the other room. In a half hour. Oh, no, the keynote's there, so yeah. This is a talk I originally did with my buddy Dan. We both came to the same conclusion about some exploitation techniques, and I'll be getting it without him, but I might have a stand-in for Dan during parts of the talk. And I encourage you to throw your schmoo-balls or whatever they're gerbils, gerbils. I encourage you to throw those at me at all times to make sure I'm paying attention to you. Don't wait to ask questions, I hate that. Yell at me if you disagree or you have something to say. I want you guys to be loud and rowdy. Somebody requested a drinking game, but I don't have enough beer, so it looks like you guys don't either.
Can you get more?
Yeah, I think Sean is supposed to bring me a beer here, but it's slow. So I guess I'll get started. I have 80 slides, so I don't plan on finishing the presentation. But, if there's any side tangents you guys just want to talk about, I'm happy to not talk about the slides I have. Oh, here we go. We're still on slide 1. Yes, the Kernel compromise. There was a turkey that was, I heard, responsible for the Kernel.org compromise. This was him at the scene of the crime, defacing Kernel.org with maintenance page. Anyway, we're not going to talk about Kernel.org, unless you guys want to, or Linux.com.
It's nice to see somebody running a decent OS.
Wait, Linux?
As opposed to other ones I've seen running presentations today.
Oh yeah, I run a secure operating system, sorry. Yeah, so, yeah, whatever, I guess. So, first slide. If you do like Linux security, you probably won't like this presentation. One motivating factor in all the work I do in kernel exploitation is Linus Torvalds, who has some interesting views on security. This was a quote from LKML, where he was talking about sort of the security circus that we're at right now. Saying that, normal bugs are the same as bugs that have security impact. Like an availability bug, it's the same impact as a request, and therefore we should treat them all the same and not classify them differently. He's of the belief that they're all bugs and they all should be fixed. And at some level that's true, but you're not going to get owned by availability bugs, but you're going to get owned by everything else. So upstream mainline kernel has some very interesting attitudes when it comes to security, not only reporting bugs, but also trying to take exploit mitigations upstream as near as possible. So while you might like Linux's operating system, if you're running a normal distribution, you're probably pretty damn secure. The other motivation was our good friend Spencer Pratt, who he is the author of GrrCON, and he had a blog post. He likes to write angry blog posts very often about. I forget what this one was ranting about, but at the end he had a call out to all these conferences that usually have this line of like exploitation presentations must be against GrrCON PAX in their CFPs, and then there never are presentations. I think partly because people don't care about GrrCON PAX because it's not widely deployed, but also because it is somewhat difficult to exploit. How many of you guys, just in the audience, have deployed GrrCON or PAX on your Linux boxes? One. Yes. Stand up. Round of applause. Here we go. Yeah, so it's not widely used, even though it can provide some additional hardening for your Linux kernel and also for user space exploit mitigations. So first thing I want to talk about was an overview of Linux kernel security, or lack thereof. If you look at the kernel vulnerabilities Linux over the years, the past decade, you can see things have been ramping up fairly really dramatically. 2005 was pretty bad. I think that was around the time 2006 was released, and there was a whole bunch of just easy DOS bugs. But if you actually break it down by severity, which is really the most important thing, the red ones are usually crevasse or information disclosure bugs. This is just rated by the CVSS score, which has a variable accuracy. But in general, there's definitely an increase in serious bugs in the last 10 years. So, let's graph only with 2009. If we actually look at 2010, which was last year, there was a whole bunch of CVs assigned, much more than 2009. And interestingly, most of these bugs, or I guess 43% of them, were discovered by just 6 people. And this is when Rosenberg went on his rush last year and picked off 47 bugs of varying severity. But another couple other guys, Case and Spender and Travis Normandy, and a bunch of other guys, lots of bugs too. So in 2010, there were 12 public exploits for local privilege escalation. Most of these bugs turned out to be sort of in exotic areas of Linux kernel. So you have a lot of packet families. You have like Econet, RDS, CAN, CAFE, Rose, all of these random packet families that no one uses yet are still loadable into the Linux kernel by an unprivileged user just by requesting creation of a socket with that packet family. So some of these bugs were in the core, but very few were in the core. Some were in sort of distro-specific code, and then of course the 2 for Red Hat. It's not just 2 bugs that affected Red Hat, those are 2 bugs that Red Hat specifically introduced into their kernel. So they're bonus ones for Red Hat. They also have all the rest of them. And if you break them down by impact, most of them are low severity denial of service, which, depending on your viewpoint, availability loss could be big if you're at like a school with a multi-user system with like 20,000 students, but the ones you really care about are privilege escalation. We classify 26 of them that are pretty sure crevasse, and 7 that, possibly if you work a while, you might be able to wrangle some crevasse. There's also one that's nothing. I don't know. That was stupid. It got a CVE even though there was no possible chance of exploitation. There's no impact whatsoever, but it was running past the boundaries of a structure that was allocated a bigger structure, and there was extra space, but whatever. So there were some fun exploits that myself and Dan wrote last year. Bull Nelson was a fun one in the Ethernet packet family. They combine 3 different vulnerabilities in order to get a null write, which once you have a null write, you just clobber a partial override of some function pointer and exploit privileges. Half Nelson was one I worked on for way too long. The Econet bugs were released last November, and I just finished and released Half Nelson like a couple weeks ago, so that wasted way too much time on that. Obviously I wasn't working on that the whole time, but it's a pretty interesting bug. It's a stack overflow as opposed to a buffer overflow on the stack. There's a difference in terminology there. So feel free to take a look at that if you're interested in stack overflows. RDS owned a lot of people. Where was RDS used? Probably, I'm guessing RDS was probably used in the kernel network compromise. A lot of these things get reused with pop unpatched boxes, unfortunately. ICANN has monoharden was a slug overflow that using a technique that Twiz and Scracker introduced way back when. And my favorite was American Sign Language, which was actually I had to write this exploit in ACPI, which is sort of your power management for your OS and BIOS. They have a special language, ACPI source language, ASL, and an ACPI machine language that's compiled to and then interpreted. So my payload was actually written in this ACPI language, which was way more about ACPI than I ever wanted to learn, but it was a fun experience. So vanilla exploitation on Linux kernel is pretty easy. If you have an arbitrary write, it's game over. Even if you have less than arbitrary write, it's just usually game over as well. There's a lot of different places that you can either influence the structures that are related to the credential management of your threaded process, or you can simply redirect control flow by overriding some function pointer or something else. controlling some data object, which then eventually results in control flow hijacking to a payload in user space. On vanilla kernels, there's a lot of info leaks available through KLSIM, SlideInfo, a lot of information that helps make your exploit more reliable. It's really not too hard on vanilla kernels once you have a bug. So what this talk is about is more about hardened kernels, being GrrCON and PAX, and what mechanisms they put in place to prevent this traditional exploitation model against vanilla kernels, and how we can actually work around some of these exploit mitigations on GrrCON. So one guy used GrrCON, which is awesome. If you guys haven't used GrrCON, you should at least take a look at it. I mean, give Spender in fact some money for putting hard work into this. They accept donations and any sort of support contracts. So if you are a company that has large Linux infrastructure and cares about not having that infrastructure owned, it might be worth to invest a little time or money into looking at GrrCON and PAX. It is free, but you can pay for support if you want. GrrCON and PAX have these sort of high-level goals in general, both for looking at user space exploitation, but also kernel exploitation. They try to, of course, prevent the execution or the introduction of additional machine code into an address space. They try to prevent the execution of existing code out of order, similar to all of rock garbage. And they also try to prevent the execution of existing code in its original order, but with different data, which can often result in privilege escalation. That last one is a pretty difficult one, but the first two are pretty well prevented in most scenarios by PAX. So some of the features of GrrCON and PAX that are useful as far as kernel land goes. KernExec, which is has its similar counterpart in user space, prevents the introduction of executable code in the address space by marking a lot of stuff that was previously read-write or read-execute to read-only. UDREF prevents you from easily popping back from kernel land into user space, so it prevents all user space pointer references, whether they're data accesses or execution. Things like SMAP from Intel was just introduced in Silicon, I think last year, and that only prevents execution, not data access in user space. So UDREF actually covers more than the stuff that Intel builds into their chips. HideSim allows you to cover up a lot of the info leaks that can be very useful if you're trying to develop a reliable Linux exploit. And ModHarden prevents all of these exploits that I talked about here, which mostly rely on really old, unmaintained code in various random packet families that you'll never use. ModHarden stops those packet families from being auto-loaded by a privileged user, so CAN, RDS, and all those guys. Really cuts off a lot of sort of attack surface. So Dan and I came up with this technique we call stackjacking because in InfoSec community, everyone likes hot buzzwords, and they always involve jacking of some sort, fire jacking or fire sheep or I don't know. We thought it would be a great term to sort of mock the terminology that people use. And what this does, it allows us to bypass some of the exploit mitigation features offered by GrrCON and PAX. And as I said, Dan and I both were sort of working in this area of exploitation and communicated privately and arrived at the fact that we both come up with this same technique with slightly different models. So we'll go over, I don't know if we'll have time for Dan's techniques. If Dan wants to come up to the stage and talk about them maybe. So we kind of have this flowchart here of what primitives we assume we have from whatever bugs, and all the steps we need to get to gain root access. It's a fairly complicated process, but we'll zoom right through it. I don't even know what time it is. Okay, I've got 45 minutes to cover 1,000 slides. So our target assumption that we're making is that you have GrrCON and PAX enabled. One dude in the audience, I'm sure you have GrrCON high configured, which really makes your system pretty unusable if you have like a desktop and you're running X or XOR. It does actually need to turn off some features of GrrCON and PAX just to run X. But really, most of those features are not as relevant to the kernel hardening. So we're assuming that this kernel exec, UniRef, IDSIM, monoharden, everything that comes on the highest default level there. We also want to make some additional assumptions, partially because we can with our exploitation techniques. So we want to make it a stronger challenge because some of these assumptions that we're making might not apply in the future. So we want to make sure we're sort of assuming the worst case and just trying to find the most generalized techniques to attack it. One thing we're assuming is we have no knowledge of the kernel address space at all. We have sort of no influence to start off with, it's a complete black box, which also includes full randomization of the kernel text data, which is not necessarily true, but we're assuming that. We're also assuming that this is going to be like a data-only attack. We're not going to be modifying any control flow, and we're not going to be introducing new code into the kernel address space to execute. So it's kind of hard, like just these two assumptions alone. You have UDREF, and you're also assuming that you can't introduce new code into the kernel space. So we can't introduce code in the kernel space, we can't introduce code in the user space. We have to do a data-only attack. So first assumption we're making is that we have an arbitrary kernel memory right, which, against a vanilla kernel, this is easily game over. It does sound like a strong assumption because, if you can write anything anywhere in kernel memory, I think you'd be able to escalate privileges. But in this case, no. We're right on the ball. Nice shot. What's that? Nice one. If someone does that from further back, they win $1,000. Payable by Sean. Sponsored by Terramark. Okay. Anytime you throw a ball at me, I'll drink. You get the mic. I'll drink for the try. So yeah, if we have a Can't see. Oh my gosh. I threw out my arm. That was a good toss. Even if we have a arbitrary kernel memory right, we can't really do anything with it because we have this whole black box, which is here's your address space. That's the upper above task size on this 32-bit. You don't know where to write. Where would we write? What would we write? We're probably going to crash the box and not do anything useful. So we have to know something. I mean, there has to be some sort of knowledge that we can leak from the kernel in order to target our arbitrary right more properly. One way to do that is just with an arbitrary kernel memory disclosure. There's been a few of these over the years. A lot of times you can dump a lot of kernel memory. It'll be like an unbounded copy to user, where you can just dump megs and megs of kernel memory and pull out interesting addresses that you can then target with your arbitrary right. But these are somewhat rare, and even some of these examples in the past, the packet-ready DVD stuff, SCTP, those two would be mitigated by all the mechanisms that GrrCON packs already put in place. So they wouldn't even be valid, and we want something that's more common and more general of a technique. So this vulnerability class was sort of interesting because it was sort of like the joke of kernel security or like the OSS stack list. Is Dan was going through 37 vulnerabilities Dan found last year in Linux kernel. I think the vast majority of them, at least 25 of them, were these sort of silly bugs that were useful to fix. I mean, as far as like, they are bugs, they are leaking some information from the kernel back to user space, but people didn't consider them have any impact. You leak some information and it's not going to be any sensitive information, what we can possibly do with it. They got like the lowest CVSS score when they're actually assigned CVEs. And what I'm talking about, of course, is kernel stack memory disclosures. Very exciting. What happens with the kernel stack memory disclosure requires a little bit of knowledge about exactly how the kernel stacks operate in Linux. So unlike user space, you have a very, very small stack in kernel space, simply because if you're on a machine that needs to support a lot of processes, you can't have enormous stack size, or else you're going to have no kernel memory left. Like, for example, on 32-bit, you have 1 gig of kernel memory dedicated to your entire machine. If you're using anything more than a page or two for each process, you're going to very quickly run on memory. And in Linux, you have most commonly an 8K stack. Sometimes there was some efforts to do 4K stacks for machines that really had pressure of a lot of processes and very limited address space, but 64 bits is sort of unnecessary now. So it's just a page or two, your entire kernel stack, and this has to, of course, contain your entire call stack, which makes system calls, subsequent calls within the kernel, and their stack frames are stored on the kernel stack there. So a kernel stack memory disclosure is leaking some of that memory that was stored on the kernel stack from a stack frame, from a system call, and that actually gets copied incorrectly or leaked back to user space. And very commonly, this is from uninitialized field of a structure. So you're defining a structure on a kernel stack. For example, you have struct foo in this hypothetical system call here, and that foo has a few members, bar, vq as, and you happen to assign 2 of those members, and then you do a copy to user the full size of the struct. You're actually, hypothetically, if there was some sensitive data on the stack in a previous system call, and in your next system call, you actually, you reuse the same stack. It's not cleared on every system call or anything. And that, foo.leak happened to overlap sensitive data. When you actually copied that full foo structure back to user space, you would then leak whatever information was on the stack previously. So for this example, when you copy back to user space, you'd be leaking 4 bytes of the kernel stack contents through this member back to user space. Of course, Dino Daizobi, aka Secure Tips, has very useful information when it comes to keeping memory uninitialized. It's a very safe technique. So we have our primitives, and we're going to show how we can use these primitives to actually exploit a GrrCON kernel. So there's not really, as I mentioned, there's not that much useful data on the kernel stack. Usually, the Linux kernel is very limited use of a stack in journals. Since you have a small stack, it's only 2 pages, and they have very efficient sort of dynamic memory allocators, the slab and slop allocators. But there might be sensitive addresses on the kernel stack, and those addresses might help inform our arbitrary right in order to escalate privileges. So, in theory, there could be a pointer to, say, a cred structure, which determines your process's, privileges and your UID and so on. So if we were able to leak one of these credential pointers off the stack, we could simply use our arbitrary right then to write to that position. We found the address of the structure, now we can write to that structure and escalate privileges. But really, that's sort of a very specific attack. You would need an exact overlap of, a cred pointer on the stack and having a stack disclosure vulnerability that overlaps that exact area of the stack frame. So it could work in some scenarios, but it's just really too specific for our needs. We want something that's more general because these kernel stack disclosures will have different sizes and different offsets of how deep they are in the kernel stack. So you might have a disclosure that's 3 bytes, and then you might have one that's 92 bytes. So finding something that works regardless of what size or offset stack disclosure is important. So came with this crazy idea to leak an address that is not only stored on the stack, but that value of that address is actually pointing to an address on the stack. So if you have a pointer that you declare, and that pointer is pointing to the address of something else on the stack, that's what we're looking for here. And this is actually pretty common, not only in the code, but also just the setup of the stack frames within the kernel stack. We can find a lot of information that gives us an address that also points to an address on the stack. So using an address of this nature, we can actually figure out from our own process where our kernel stack is located. And we call that K-stack self-discovery. So if we have a pointer on the stack, this red area, this is what we're leaking back to user space, and that pointer actually points to the stack itself. Suddenly, we've leaked off, this CDEF 1, 2, 3, 4. We know that is contained, within our kernel stack somewhere, and then if we just mask it off with, the thread size, we know exactly where the base of our kernel stack is in kernel memory, which can be very useful, as we'll see. And this can be done trying to figure out, what information is leaked back to user space. You can either look at it manually and try to figure out, make a bunch of system calls. You get sort of a variety, you get a sampling of different information for each system call that you're leaking back to user space. And you can sort of derive what this kernel stack base is from that, or you can use this automated tool we wrote, which sort of calls, system calls randomly, and then tries to derive the kernel stack base just by looking at, we can find enough confidence, we have enough values in common that this is indeed a stack pointer, a pointer to something on stack as opposed to a pointer to somewhere else in the kernel memory. So that's the first stage of this process, is figuring out exactly where our kernel stack is in memory. That gets us a very small stepping stone in our process. It's no longer a complete black box. We now know the location of something in kernel memory, and we still have our arbitrary write. So in theory we can write anything to this kernel stack now. So the question becomes, where do we actually write in this kernel stack, and what do we actually write? There is a lot of course, pointers and data within the kernel stack itself. But even if we were able to write to a particular part of the kernel stack, we wouldn't really know what to do with it. If it was a function pointer, we couldn't use it because we'd have to write. If we overrode a function pointer with a user space address and tried to pop control flow over to user space, we can't do that because of UDREF. And really, we don't have much visibility elsewhere in the kernel, so we couldn't, point to a function pointer as some other kernel function either. So we still have to do a little bit of work. There is some very interesting metadata that's stored on the kernel stack on Linux. Your stack goes down, and at the very bottom, or sort of the base of the kernel stack, depending on how you're looking at the memory, is this thread info structure. And thread info is used, it's stored at the base of the stack to sort of have a shortcut, since it has members that are very commonly used during the execution of a process, so it helps to be able to access it quickly just by masking off a stack pointer and finding out the address of this thread info. So there's a lot of very sensitive structures in here. There are some interesting targets. For example, the adder limit member of that struct defines where sort of the boundary is between user space and kernel space. So if you overwrite that, you could potentially write into kernel memory. Restart block is a function pointer, but again, function pointer is not going to do us much good because we can't redirect control flow anywhere useful. So we wanted to look at the task struct, which is the very first one there. And task struct contains our credential struct for our process or our thread. So if we can actually modify the credential structure, then we can escalate the privileges of our process with the data-only attack, not having to modify control flow. But in order to actually write to this structure, we sort of have to follow these pointers. We have to figure out what the pointer, or what the address of task struct is, which is the very first member on the base of our stack. And then also within task struct, we have to be able to find the pointer to the credential structure in order to follow that, and then use our arbitrary write to overwrite our UID, GID, and capabilities and so on. So, we've kind of been able to figure out what our plan of attack is here. If we actually can read sort of the base of the kernel stack here, we can find our task struct, then we can read the task struct to find our credentials. So it's very obvious that we have some information leaked from the kernel, but we need to construct a more useful read primitive in order to read additional kernel memory to achieve our goal. So what we have is our kernel leak, our kernel memory disclosure, and also a write. And we want to take these two primitives and then combine them into an arbitrary read. An arbitrary read will get us the capability then to read those pointers and sort of finish off our attack by writing into the credential structure and doing whatever you want after that. So we still don't have the middle period, middle portion here. We have our self-discovery. We know once we get our read, we'll be able to do our stack tracking. but we have to do our stack groping first. Again, buzzword city, probably inappropriate buzzword city, but it's the only thing we can come up with. So Dan came up with a technique, as I mentioned. I'll go through this somewhat quickly. That there is a adder limit member of this thread infrastructure, which is stored on the base. And adder limit, anytime you do a copy from user, copy to user, there's an access OK check in the Linux kernel. And access OK checks to make sure that, if you're actually copying, to user space, you want to make sure that you're actually copying to user space and not into kernel space. So it makes sure that you're not sort of tricking the kernel into writing into its own memory. So if you change this adder limit, suddenly you can write into kernel memory. And this is a sort of interesting technique because it is somewhat reliable, or more reliable, Dan's Rosengrove technique, because there is a very static offset from thread info, making it very easy, easy address to write into it the arbitrary write once you know the base of the kernel stack. So you say, I know the base of the kernel stack, and I want to go up, like 30 bytes or whatever to the adder limit, and then, write a very high value so that the kernel thinks that, all addresses their user space, including its own kernel memory. It gets a little tricky on PAX and GrrSec, simply because PAX UDREF uses segmentation on x86. So you have to sort of time this right, but it only takes a few seconds to actually min erase, schedule an erase, and it's a very safe race. You're not going to crash the kernel or anything. To reload the GS register and make sure that it has the proper, or your overwritten adder limit value as opposed to the previous one. Now, one of the downsides of Dan's technique is that it does depend on this, thread info struct to be on the base of the stack. There's really no reason for it to be on the base of the stack. There's sort of ancient history of Linux. It was stored there for performance purposes, making it very easy to access when it's necessary. So, the pros are that it is fairly generic and simple, but the cons is that it actually depends on thread info being at the base of the stack. So, what Spender actually did, I think it was like a week before our presentation, he actually was planning to get some preliminary patches to move thread info out of the kernel stack, simply because it was actually due to Tavis's IPconf bug, the deep recursion or infinite recursion IPconf decompression that you found on all the BSD kernels. Spender sort of panicked and said, that could happen on Linux, let's move thread info off of the kernel stack and put it somewhere else. We'll store a per CPU pointer to thread info as opposed to sticking it on the stack there, which makes a lot of sense. Of course, mainline should do it, but they never will. So, my overgrowth technique was a little bit crazier, which we had, this is where Dan and I differed in our exploitation techniques, even though we both had the same idea. So I remember talking to Dan over email, and I was like, how can we get an arbitrary read from this? I was like, what if we clobber, process this kernel stack frame while it's in a system call? And Dan sort of gave me this look over email, like, what the fuck are you talking about? So that's what my overgrowth technique sort of focuses around. It's not actually looking at the metadata that's at the end of the kernel stack, which can be removed if necessary. We're looking at the contents of the stack frames themselves. So when you make a system call, the call stack that the kernel's taking, your user space process is done, traffic control goes to the kernel, and the kernel is creating stack frames. On the kernel stack, we're going to attack the data within those stack frames itself. And our end goal is to actually get a read here. So how can we read data by writing within a kernel stack frame? And if you just think about it, with a write, normally you should be able to achieve a read, but it actually turns out to be a little bit tricky. So there's a couple observations we made. There's a lot of code paths in the kernel that will copy data to userland via sort of the copy to user family of functions. And there might be copy to user functions that use a source address. So the source address is whatever they're copied to user space. That source address at some point during the system call might be pushed onto the kernel stack by some code. And so if we can actually find the code paths that will push the source address of a copy to user call onto the stack, and we know the offset where that address was actually pushed onto the stack, we can overwrite that, that source address when it's stored on the stack. So when we put this on there, we can hit it, and then later when it gets popped back off and used in this copy to user call, we can control the source of the copy to user call, which means that we can leak, arbitrary kernel memory back to user space. So it's a little complicated, and the tricky part is, how we have like a parent process that's trying to write into a child's kernel stack, while that child is actually executing code, whether it's in user land or in kernel space. So how do we actually time this exactly so that when the child calls system call, it pushes the source address of copy to user onto the stack, does some stuff, comes back and pops it off, we have to actually overwrite it within that very small window. So what we can do instead is actually find a system call that's going to push this register on the stack, go to sleep for an arbitrary amount of time, controlled by us, and then wake up and pop the register off the stack and use it as a source of copy to user. So we call these sleepy system calls, and it turns out there's a lot of system calls, such as like nano sleep or wait for or wait PID you can use to actually put a process to sleep, and then hopefully one of these system calls meets our needs for then popping the register off the stack and using it as a source for a copy to user type call. It turns out that one of the wait ID functions, the 32-bit compatibility layer, actually does do this. So it has this structure that's on the stack, the RUsage structure. It will put the process to sleep, and at some point, the address of this RUsage structure will be pushed onto the stack, so we can overwrite it. And then later, after the process wakes up, it uses put compat RUsage to copy from that source address back to user space. And we can control the copy to user and leak our arbitrary amount of kernel memory. So we sort of constructed a arbitrary read from our arbitrary write in our kernel stack memory leak. There's this big process. There's this very complex flow, which has very horrible implications for our jacking and groping names, because it's all about like the parent and child process, like the parents groping the child, and it turns out to be very, very horrible. We should have done better naming. But so that actually completes our overview. We use our kernel stack self-discovery to figure out what the base of the kernel is. We use our arbitrary write and our kernel stack leak in order to get an arbitrary read. And then once we have an arbitrary read and arbitrary write, we can simply read our thread info and our cache struct and the address of our credential structure and overwrite the credentials of our process and escalate our privileges. And I don't think I have the VM on my laptop for a live demo, but it works. We have the code out there if you want to play with it on your own system. Or the one guy that runs GrrSec if you want to try this out. I guess it depends on when you last updated GrrSec. People who use GrrSec and packs tend to think that they're not, they can't be hacked, so they just never update their kernel, so it usually doesn't work out too well. I guess I got 20 more minutes, so we can talk about some of the fallout from this, which is sort of the more entertaining piece, depending on your point of view. We gave this presentation at HES back a few months ago, and Spender wrote a pretty angry blog post. In our HES presentation, we had proposed some of these fixes. Spender and Packs are way smarter than us, so they can figure out what mitigations are necessary to prevent this type of attack. But this is so small. Spender wrote this really, really long blog post about how we're horrible people, and I really respect Brad, so it was not unexpected, but we were upset that he was that angry about it. So. I encourage you guys to actually read this blog post, and just the GrrSec blog in general. Spender has some good rants about computer security in general, and particularly around exploit mitigations. So as part of this blog post, they roll out some good fixes to some of our techniques that we proposed. One was, they moved thread info off the kernel stack, completely, which was more in response to Tavis's bugs, but it was also hastened by I guess the Rosen Grove technique that Dan came up with, and also Bex made Rand K-Stack work on 64-bit. So Rand K-Stack is an interesting feature that on every single system call, your kernel stack pointer will start at a different offset. So my overgrowth technique, which requires us to sort of write at a particular offset to hit some saved register on the kernel stack, makes it very difficult because every system call is going to be at a different offset. You never know exactly what that offset is, so you're sort of running blindly against the kernel stack, and you probably end up crashing the process. And they had some other improvements to PAX's user copying functionality to make any sort of copy to user information leaking much more difficult. So they sort of killed this entire middle section here, which was our stack groping, which allows us to construct the arbitrary read from our arbitrary write and our kernel stack memory disclosure. And that made Dan and Jon very sad. Spender called our technique dead and thought we were actually screwing him over, even though that was not the intention. Right, Rocky needs another picture here. Send him to Spender immediately. So, this stack tracking really dead. In its current form, maybe so. But, there actually is a slightly different technique that, I sort of alluded to previously. I was talking about we could possibly screw all this stuff in the middle and just leak very specific addresses off the kernel stack. Like I mentioned, if you could leak the address of the credential structure directly from the kernel stack and not have to worry about all this broken garbage, you could simply overwrite your credentials immediately. And we call this out as being too specific of an attack simply because you have to make sure that your kernel stack memory disclosure actually had the exact offset of where this cred struct pointer was on the stack. So, it's very specific, and it might only work for some kernel stack disclosures that are very large or happen to have very particular offsets. But what we realized is that this Rand K-Stack feature, which was sort of expanded to 64-bit to help mitigate our attacks here, which randomizes the stack pointer on each system call, actually makes exploitation of these type of conditions much, much easier. So, part of the fixes they rolled out actually made the problem a lot worse, or a lot simpler for exploitation purposes. Since now we have, let's say we have this stack frame for some system call, and there's a sensitive data at some offset that, an arbitrary offset on the kernel stack. Let's say that's the pointer to our credential structure is actually in that red box there. Even though we only have like a static kernel stack memory disclosure, say, normally it would just leak where foo.leak is at that offset. With Rand K-Stack, suddenly on every system call, you have a randomized sort of start of your stack frames. So you can call this a bunch of times, just keep calling on these system calls, and eventually you're going to get an overlap since this offset is randomized on every system call. Damn it! So eventually you're going to hit, you're going to find your sensitive data, you're going to find your credential structure. It sort of exacerbates the problem in 5 minutes. Ah, shit. It makes the problem of a kernel stack memory disclosure much more severe. It's not just a leak of 4 bytes, it's a leak of pretty much the entire stack frame of how much data you want to read. So, so you're sort of in a tough place here. You can use Rand K-Stack. You'll get credjacked or whatever the hell that means. But if you don't use Rand K-Stack, then you get overgrowth by me. So, it's a sort of a tough trade-off. And that was our stack checking 2.0. So I have like no time left, but Pipbax came up with some really cool stuff, which uses GCC's plugin framework, so you can actually write a plugin for GCC such that when you're compiling a program, you can actually run code that operates on like the equal representation within GCC of your code. So he wrote some really crazy stuff that will actually do what we mentioned here as being sort of crazy. He actually clears the entire kernel stack between system calls, which can be pretty expensive depending on how much you're clearing. But he uses these GCC plugins to make it a little bit more reasonable. For example, you only need to clear as much of the kernel stack as you use. You don't have to clear out a full 2 pages in order to get this view of however much actually needs to be cleared. So that actually goes about and stops the attack in a more general manner, but it is a feature that's similar to like Pax Mem Sanitize, which most people probably don't use, even if you configure your GrrSec kernel with GrrCorsec high. Pax Mem Sanitize isn't enabled simply because of the performance constraints around it. So we'll see what happens with that. Maybe the performance will be reasonable, but people might not be willing to pay like a 10% penalty just to prevent against these kinds of attacks. So stack checking might live on. And that's it. Thank you guys. Just ask a question about something.
What's next for Duo?
Oh, there we go. That's a good question. I can pimp Duo while I'm up here. If you guys are in the need of some awesome two-factor authentication, check out duosecurity.com. It's pretty sick. And if you want to see a demo, come up here afterwards and I'll show you a nice live demo of our two-factor. We're a local company and we do the best two-factor around, so if any of your companies are looking to replace RSA after they got owned, we won't get owned.